War has a way of swallowing brilliance. History remembers the generals, the medals, the speeches. But the quiet flashes of genius born in mud, fear, and desperation, those are the stories that slip through the cracks. In March 1944, deep in the chaos of the Italian campaign, a single frustrated corporal, a former pool hall hustler with no formal education, attempted a sniper shot that military doctrine insisted was physically impossible. His idea was so unorthodox, so absurd on paper, that entire units dismissed it as madness. But war doesn't reward the predictable. And in one eerie, windless moment across the Rapido River Valley, this nobody from Boston squeezed his trigger, and the battlefield changed. The shot traveled 480 yards, bent itself through a 3-inch structural gap, ricocheted off steel, and killed a German observer no one could even see. A trick shot, a miracle, or the moment an overlooked mind rewrote sniper psychology forever. This is the untold story of James Keller, the man who thought in angles when everyone else thought in straight lines. If stories like this fascinate you, the hidden moments, the unheard heroes, the breakthroughs born from desperation, make sure to hit like and subscribe. It helps this channel bring more of these rare, overlooked histories to life. And hey, if you enjoy deep dive true crime style war psychology, you're in the right place. Just before midday on March 14, 1944, the Rapido River Valley held a kind of silence that didn't belong in war. No screaming artillery, no rattling machine gun bursts, just an eerie stillness, the kind that makes the air feel too light for the weight it's carrying. Corporal James "Jimmy" Keller lay prone on the cold stone floor of a ruined farmhouse, the jagged window frame biting into his ribs as he steadied his rifle. 480 yards away sat a German observation bunker, so perfectly engineered it might as well have been carved out of the mountain itself. For 3 weeks, every attempt to silence it had ended in death. Snipers with shattered throats, infantry torn apart by artillery they never saw coming. Keller had watched friends die trying to crack it. He wasn't supposed to succeed. No one was. Yet here he was, eyes fixed on a target he couldn't even see, preparing to take a shot, so improbable it would have sounded insane if he'd spoken it aloud. Nothing about this moment felt heroic. His palms were slick with sweat. His thumb throbbed from a cut he'd gotten opening a C ration. And as he stared through that scope, he knew deep in the anxiety-tangled center of his chest that if he failed, the next men to die would be the ones who trusted the system more than their instincts. The bunker itself looked ordinary at a glance, a concrete box with a slit barely wide enough for a rifle barrel. But to anyone who understood angles, shadows, and physics, it was a masterpiece of German engineering. The firing slit was offset, so enemy snipers couldn't draw a straight line into it. The walls were 3 feet thick. The observer inside stood far enough back that even a perfect shot couldn't find him. Every calculation said the man inside was untouchable. That was the point, that Keller wasn't thinking in the clean, logical lines the army taught. He was thinking in ricochets, in trajectories, in the strange geometry he'd learned hustling pool players years before the war. He had spent nights sketching diagrams on cigarette packs, scribbling tiny numbers by candlelight while other men tried to sleep. And eventually, after days of staring at that damn bunker, he found something no one else had seen, a 3-inch structural gap above the firing slit where a steel I-beam met the wall. If he could land a shot precisely into that shadow, if he could angle the bullet so it would skip off the beam's inner surface, he could force the round downward into the bunker like a pool ball banking off a rail. It sounded ridiculous even to him, absurd, blasphemy against military doctrine. But doctrine had already cost Morrison his life. Doctrine had killed Chen, and it had killed Donovan. So Keller steadied his breathing and prepared to trust the one thing the army hadn't given him, his own way of seeing the world. Windless days were rare in the valley, but the air on March 14th had settled into an unnatural stillness, the kind of stillness that made superstitious men cross themselves. Keller didn't. He simply breathed out, slow and controlled, letting his pulse flatten the way every sniper is trained to do. In his scope, the 3-inch gap looked like a thin line of darkness, hardly enough to fit a pencil through, let alone a .3006 round, fired from nearly 5 football fields away. The shot demanded perfection, the right elevation, the right wind drift, the right understanding of how steel would redirect a bullet at a downward angle of roughly 40 degrees. No manuals covered this, no instructor had approved it. His captain had only given permission because he saw something desperate in Keller's eyes. A final attempt for a position that had taken too many lives. As Keller exhaled, the valley seemed to pause with him, just a heartbeat, just enough space for fate to listen in. Then, in that sliver of stillness, where the world narrows to a crosshair and a decision, Keller squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked. The report cracked through the valley. A vapor trail flashed and vanished, and then nothing. No sound, no scream, no confirmation, just silence so absolute it felt like the world was holding its breath. For nearly a full minute, Keller didn't move a muscle. Sniper protocol demanded stillness, but this was something deeper, something primal. Through the scope, the bunker remained unchanged, a dead grey rectangle. Doubt coiled tight in his lungs. Maybe the angle was wrong. Maybe the beam wasn't aligned the way he'd calculated. Maybe Morrison had died for nothing. 47 seconds ticked by in the tension-soaked quiet. Then, suddenly, a German soldier burst out of the bunker's rear door, frantic and waving toward another man behind him. More followed running, shouting, stumbling over themselves in a panic that had no place on an otherwise calm afternoon. Keller didn't need to hear the words to understand. Something inside the bunker had gone horribly, irreversibly wrong for them. He held his scope steady, watching the chaos unfold, watching the once impenetrable strong points unravel in real time, and slowly, very slowly, the realization settled over him. He'd made the impossible shot. No doctrine, no blueprint, just instinct, grief, geometry, and a willingness to think in ways nobody else did. Across the valley, the bunker fell silent. The Germans abandoned it. And in that quiet, lonely farmhouse, with his hands still trembling, Keller understood that the war had just shifted because one overlooked man had dared to imagine an angle no one else believed existed. He didn't start out as a soldier, and certainly not as a man destined to reshape how armies thought about shooting. Years before Italy, before the Rapido Valley, before the weight of war pressed itself into his bones, James Keller was just a skinny kid drifting between the cracked sidewalks and smoky rooms of Charlestown, Massachusetts. His childhood was the kind you don't put in history books, a cramped 3-room apartment that for her smelled like boiled cabbage, diesel from the naval yard, and the faint bitterness of a family stretched thin. Money was tight, the kind of tight that forces you to grow up too fast. His father worked impossible hours loading munitions, his back giving out long before his spirit ever did. And Jimmy, observant and oddly quiet for a kid his age, absorbed the world around him in angles, patterns, and quiet details people rarely noticed. What saved him from the gravity of poverty wasn't school or church or some well-meaning mentor. It was a pool hall. Murphy's Pool Hall, to be exact, the dim little sanctuary on Main Street that buzzed with cigarette haze and the shouting laughter of men who'd spent their entire lives one paycheck away from collapse. Jimmy didn't go there to gamble or rebel. He went there because those wooden tables and felt surfaces made sense to him, a way the rest of life didn't. He saw geometry long before he knew the word for it. When a ball rolled, he tracked its spin. When it struck a rail, he saw the angle before the impact even happened. Other kids talked about stickball or the Red Sox. Jimmy talked about predictable chaos, though he didn't yet know that was what he meant. Mr. Murphy, a thick-jawed man who'd been around enough hustlers to recognize a natural-born mind, once told him, "Most folks see the ball and the pocket. Kid, You see the spaces in between. And he was right. Jimmy could predict 3, 4, sometimes 5 moves ahead, visualizing impossible shots the same way a musician hears music others miss. By 16, life dealt him a harsher angle. His father's back failed for good, leaving Jimmy to step into the gritty, punishing world of rigging work at the Navy Yard. Blueprints replaced chalked pool tables, steel cables replaced cue sticks, but the instinct stayed the same: measure distance, calculate stress, anticipate failure before it happened. He could look at a crane load and know whether the beam would hold or snap. Supervisors trusted his calculations even though he'd barely finished school. It was honest work, dangerous work, and it carved a sense of responsibility into him. Not the noble kind they write on medals, but the kind that comes from knowing one wrong angle can kill a man. When Pearl Harbor hit, he didn't hesitate. He enlisted the next morning, not out of patriotism or heroism, but because the world had jolted forward and he wasn't the kind of man who stood still when things broke. At Fort Benning, Jimmy didn't blend in the way he'd blended behind a pool table. His shooting scores were too clean, too precise. And the way he approached targets made instructors uneasy, while other recruits fired straight ahead like they were reading from a manual. Jimmy shot from strange positions, around obstacles, under barriers, adjusting himself to angles no one else used. It wasn't rebellion. It was instinct. When a sergeant wrote, "Kid shoots like he's playing geometry instead of war," he wasn't wrong. That line earned Jimmy a spot among the snipers, even though nobody knew exactly what kind of sniper he would become. North Africa hardened him. Sicily sharpened him. By the time he reached Italy, he had 19 confirmed kills, not because he loved the trigger, but because he understood that war was just another brutal table, and sometimes survival depended on seeing the shot no one else could. He arrived in Italy already carrying the quiet heaviness that settles into a soldier who has seen too many things too early. But nothing prepared him for the Rapido Valley. The terrain itself felt hostile, steep, cold, jagged, and shaped in a way that gave the Germans the kind of advantage textbooks call decisive. Every bunker was embedded into the mountain like a tooth, every firing slit carved with intentional cruelty. And then there was the artillery, relentless, disciplined, frighteningly accurate. The Germans weren't just shooting at shapes in the distance. They were watching the valley through observers who saw everything, every movement, every shadow, every attempt to advance. Those observers didn't just guide artillery. They dictated life and death with a pair of binoculars and a radio. Jimmy learned this the hard way, watching assault after assault collapse under perfectly timed shelling. He'd seen chaos before, but this was different. This wasn't chaos. This was precision, cold, clinical, devastating precision, the kind that made a man feel hunted. Strong Point 7 became the name, whispered with dread among the men. A bunker perched into the mountainside like a viper's eye. 3 feet of reinforced concrete, a firing slip position just off the natural line of sight from every American vantage point. And somewhere deep inside, a German observer who might as well have been a ghost. Every time an American unit made a move, artillery landed within seconds. It wasn't luck. It wasn't guesswork. It was the bunker. He watched the first sniper die, trying to silence it. Lieutenant Marcus Chen, a quiet, meticulous man who'd once shown Jimmy a photograph of his fiancée tucked inside his helmet. Chen had tried at dawn, hoping to catch a silhouette through the slit. His shot sparked off the concrete. The return fire came fast and cruel. Jimmy heard it before he saw the aftermath, one dreadful crack, the kind that makes a man freeze because something irreversible has just happened. Chen never got the chance to fire again. 9 days later, somewhere in Sacramento, Dorothy received a telegram folded with military precision, but written with unbearable finality. Days later, it was Morrison, soft-spoken, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who carried hope with him even when conditions were bleak. Jimmy had shared a foxhole with him the night before. Morrison had handed him a photo of his daughter laughing on a tire swing, the simple kind of joy that doesn't fit inside a war. "When I get home," Morrison had said, "I'm taking her fishing every weekend. No excuses." The next morning, Morrison tried to suppress the bunker by force, emptying round after round into the slit in an act of stubborn bravery. It didn't work. Artillery rained down. By the time the smoke cleared, the tire swing promise died with him. Jimmy helped bury him that afternoon, staring at the patch of earth as though it should have refused to accept a man like Morrison. Then came Donovan, barely 20, built like a boxer, but too young to fully understand the way war rearranges a person's soul. He tried to get close under the cover of smoke. The machine gun fire cut through it as if the smoke didn't exist at all. The cruel part wasn't how quickly he died. It was how long it took to recover his body. 4 days, 4 long days of knowing he was out there alone in that grey, torn landscape. Those weren't just losses on a battlefield, they were fractures. Quiet breaks inside a man who had already seen too many names disappear into the dirt, and with every death, strong .7 remained untouched, a silent, taunting reminder that the enemy wasn't just better positioned. They were outthinking the Americans in ways that hurt far beyond strategy. Jimmy stopped sleeping those nights. He wasn't haunted by the fear of dying. That part of his mind had gone numb long ago. What kept him awake was the unbearable repetition of failure. The bunker kept killing, and nobody had a solution. Every briefing ended with the same cold assessment: no viable approach, no angle, no possibility. But Jimmy refused to accept that. A lifetime of watching balls ricochet across felt tables, a lifetime of studying loads and beams and weight under tension. It all began pressing at the edges of his thoughts. War had a way of forcing the mind into corners, and in those corners, Jimmy found shapes, gaps, shadows. He started sketching on cigarette packs, drawing crude diagrams, tracing the geometry of the bunker, the way he once traced impossible pull shots. He wasn't chasing heroism. He was chasing the only thing he had left. The idea that maybe, somewhere inside that concrete monster, there existed an angle no one had seen. And for the first time since arriving in the valley, a flicker of possibility took shape. Just a flicker, but enough to make him look at the bunker differently. Enough to make him wonder if straight lines weren't the only way to fight a war built on angles. He spent the next 6 days studying that bunker with an obsession that unnerved the men around him. While others tried to snatch a few hours of sleep or warm their hands over a ration heater, Jimmy sat with a carpenter's protractor he'd borrowed from an engineering unit, tracing invisible lines in the air. He watched the way sunlight slid across the concrete. He memorized how shadows stretched and shrank as the hours passed. To anyone else, it looked like he was staring at nothing. But Jimmy wasn't looking at the bunker itself. He was looking inside it, imagining every beam, every support, every angle where steel met stone. He wasn't searching for the obvious. He was searching for the overlooked. Eventually, he found it. A 3-inch void, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. A structural gap where a roof beam met the wall, sitting just above the firing slit like a sliver of accidental darkness. It wasn't designed to be a weakness. It was simply the reality of construction. But to Jimmy, it was an opening, a microscopic window of possibility, a place where a bullet could slip in, touch steel, and then follow his calculated angle downward like a banked pull shot. The idea shouldn't have made sense. Every rifle manual he'd ever read insisted that trick shots were unreliable fantasies. But Jimmy didn't think in straight lines, and for the first time since Morrison died, he felt something spark in him, a strange mix of anger, hope, and the stubborn defiance of a man who refuses to accept that the world is built the way everyone says it is. When he finally walked into the command tent and placed his crude sketches in front of Captain Hayes, the man stared at them with the wary expression of someone confronted with either genius or madness. "You want to bank a rifle round?" Hayes asked, incredulous. "Off an I-beam. Jimmy didn't flinch. He explained the angle, the elevation advantage, the calculations, how the German engineers had unwittingly left a shot open for anyone who knew how to think like a pool player instead of a soldier. Hayes listened in silence, cigarette burning low between his fingers. The soldiers outside murmured about the impossible. The valley remained deadly and unchanged, and in the middle of that bleak tension, Hayes had to decide whether to let a corporal attempt a shot that could get him court-martialed or worse, celebrated as a lucky lunatic. After a long pause, Hayes finally exhaled and said, "One shot, Keller. If you miss, it ends here." Jimmy returned to the ruined farmhouse that night with nerves buzzing under his skin. Everything depended on precision, the wind, the angle, the temperature, the small cut on his thumb that kept catching on the rifle stock. War has a way of magnifying small things until they feel enormous, and every tiny variable clawed at his focus. He lay awake listening to artillery rumble far off in the distance, imagining the steel beam inside the bunker, the bullet's path, the moment of contact. He wasn't thinking of glory or recognition. He was thinking of Morrison's daughter on the tire swing, of Chen's fiancée who would never see him again, of Donovan lying alone in that crater 4 days. Jimmy didn't want to be a hero. He wanted the killing to stop. And if that meant taking a shot the world said was impossible, then impossible would simply have to bend. Morning came cold and strangely quiet, the kind of quiet that makes a soldier feel suspended between dread and opportunity. Jimmy rose before the others, not because he was eager, but because his body couldn't hold any more waiting. He moved through the shattered farmhouse with careful steps, each crunch of debris under his boots reminding him just how fragile this plan really was. Outside, the valley stretched in a grey haze, still unwatchful. It didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like an examination room, as if the day itself were waiting to see whether his calculations would collapse under the weight of reality. Jimmy set up his rifle, checked the stock, adjusted the scope. His hands shook at first, just a small tremor, the kind you get when your mind is too loud and your heartbeat too close to your ears. But once he lay prone and pressed his cheek against the wood, the tremor faded. Familiarity washed over him. A rifle, in the end, wasn't all that different from a cue stick, an extension of instinct, a tool that obeys angles more than it obeys fear. He scanned the bunker again through the scope, studying that 3-inch darkness above the firing slit. It still seemed impossibly small, like trying to thread a needle with gloves on, and yet the geometry held. He repositioned his body by millimeters, letting muscle memory guide him into alignment. War forced precision into a man not the tidy, academic kind, but the desperate kind that comes when hesitation means death. He accounted for elevation. He accounted for the I-beam's slight tilt. He accounted for the shallow afternoon temperature drop that would subtly thicken the valley air. A younger version of him might have doubted, might have overthought. But Jimmy had lived through enough to know that sometimes you have to trust the way your mind works, even if nobody else understands it. Moments before he fired, an unexpected calm drifted over him. The screaming artillery, the deaths, the frustrations, the grieving faces, everything dimmed into the background. The world narrowed to a crosshair and a sliver of shadow. All the noise dissolved. For a heartbeat, he wasn't in Italy. He was back in the pool hall as a teenager, chalk dust floating in sunbeams, Murphy leaning over a table saying, "You see shots nobody else even thinks about." That memory didn't bring pride. It brought clarity. Jimmy breathed in, then exhaled slowly until there was no breath left to give. His finger tightened. The trigger broke cleanly, the rifle kicked. The echo rolled across the valley. And then there was nothing, no spark, no confirmation, no sign that anything had changed. The silence that followed was so absolute it made his stomach lurch. He didn't blink, didn't breathe, didn't move. He held his eye to the scope, waiting for the valley to reveal its judgment. 10 seconds, 20, 30, the bunker stayed still, unmoved, indifferent. Doubt clawed its way up his spine. Maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe the angle failed. Maybe he'd risked everything, his career, his reputation, his life on a trick shot that physics simply wouldn't allow. Then, at 47 seconds, a blur of motion erupted from the bunker's rear door. One German soldier burst out, frantic, waving to another behind him. They moved with a panic that soldiers don't perform unless something catastrophic has happened inside. Two more emerged, shouting, scrambling, disappearing back in, then out again. No one had to tell Jimmy what that meant. The silence inside the slit was no longer calculated. It was the silence of a fortification suddenly, unexpectedly blind. He exhaled, not triumphantly, but in quiet disbelief. Against doctrine, against logic, against every rule written by men, far from the front lines, his impossible angle had worked. And as the Germans abandoned strong point 7, Jimmy stayed frozen in that ruined farmhouse, hands trembling, knowing the war had just tilted because he dared to see a path no one else could. The news spread through the division the way wildfire spreads through dry grass, quiet at first, then suddenly everywhere at once. Men who had spent weeks cursing that bunker now spoke of it in lowered voices, as if afraid the valley might overhear and take the victory back. Jimmy didn't feel like a hero. He felt wrung out, hollowed by the pressure of the shot and the ghosts it carried. Captain Hayes found him not long after, boots crunching over rubble, breath still sharp from hurrying up the incline. He didn't congratulate him, not immediately. Instead, he stared at Jimmy with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and a kind of reluctant respect. "You hit it," Hayes finally said, voice low. "You actually hit it." Jimmy didn't answer. He didn't know how. The captain lit a cigarette with hands that shook just enough to betray how close he'd come to denying that shot altogether. "I'm not writing this up," he murmured, smoke trailing from the corner of his mouth. "If this gets out officially, every sniper in Italy will try it and get themselves killed." And that was it. No medal, no commendation, just the knowledge that the impossible had quietly, secretly become real. But news doesn't need paperwork to spread. By nightfall, snipers from 2 neighboring companies were asking for diagrams. By morning, 4 men were crouched in the dirt near Jimmy, tracing rough sketches on canteen lids and ration boxes, hungry to understand the geometry behind the madness. There was no ego in the way Jimmy taught them, no pride. Just a tired clarity as he explained angles, ricochets, deflection paths, things he'd internalized long before the war. They listened like students at the feet of a reluctant professor, nodding with wide eyes, as if absorbing a forbidden lesson. Jimmy didn't dramatize it, didn't embellish. He simply showed them what was possible when you stopped thinking like an instruction manual and started thinking like someone whose life depended on invention. And in that quiet exchange, the war began to shift in ways official records would never acknowledge. What nobody anticipated was how quickly the Germans noticed. They depended on their observation posts the way the Americans depended on air support. Losing strong point 7 wasn't just a tactical inconvenience, it was a shock to a system built on certainty. Days later, German engineers inspected the ruined bunker and found bullet marks in places no bullet should have reached. Deep scrapes in steel, impact scars along the beams. Strange, downward entry wounds. They tried to explain it as a lucky shot, a fluke, maybe even an accident. But then it happened again. Another observer dropped in a fortified position that had been considered perfectly safe. Then another, and another. It was as if the Americans had suddenly developed the ability to see through walls, to bend physics, to make bullets turn corners. German intelligence reports described it as unprecedented capability. They didn't understand the geometry. They didn't understand Jimmy. They just felt the consequences. And the consequences grew. Bunkers once considered invulnerable were abandoned. German observers were forced to stand farther back from slits, which dulled their visibility and slowed their artillery response. There was fear now, quiet, subtle, but unmistakable. The kind of fear that changes behavior, the kind that alters a battlefield without firing a single extra shot. American infantry noticed immediately. Advances that once took hours of bloody struggle were suddenly met with hesitation instead of precision shelling. Casualty rates dipped, morale lifted in places where hope had been thin. And all the while, Jimmy kept teaching, quietly, carefully, without ever claiming ownership of the transformation he'd sparked. He didn't celebrate the spread of the technique. He didn't seek recognition. To him, each bunker neutralized meant 3 fewer names carved into grief. It wasn't glory. It was survival shared, multiplied, and whispered through the ranks like a secret prayer. The technique spread so quietly, it never touched a single official document, yet it moved through the ranks with the certainty of a rumor everyone wanted to believe. Snipers from different companies gathered around Jimmy like apprentices around a blacksmith, each man bringing his own questions, doubts, and hopes. They crouched beside him in foxholes or leaned over rough wooden tables at night, lanterns flickering against tired faces as Jimmy traced arcs in the dirt with a stick. He didn't lecture, he didn't pasture, he simply showed them how to see structures the way he saw pool tables, not as static shapes, but as systems of tension, deflection, and hidden opportunity. Some grasped it quickly, others stared for long moments before the realization clicked, and in those moments, Jimmy felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: purpose. Not the violent kind tied to rifles and death, but the kind that saves people quietly, invisibly. Within days, men he had never met were attempting their first beam gap shots. Some missed, some hit. And every success echoed in the strange way battlefields change, not with cheers or triumph, but with a sudden absence of danger. Bunkers that had held 4 weeks fell silent after a single trembling squeeze of a trigger. German observers, once untouchable overseers, were now vulnerable in ways they never imagined. Entire platoons advanced across stretches of open terrain that had previously been death traps. The atmosphere shifted. Soldiers stopped, looking at strong points like immovable gods carved into stone. They began seeing them as puzzles, brutal ones, yes, but solvable, as they could learn to think the way Jimmy thought. And that quiet shift in perception did something remarkable. It restored agency to men who'd felt powerless for too long. The Germans, for their part, scrambled to adapt. They increased the distance between observers and the firing slits, forcing them farther back into the bunker shadows. This blunted their vision, slowing how quickly they could request artillery. It bought precious minutes, sometimes only 30 seconds, sometimes to full minutes. But in combat, even seconds can separate survival from annihilation. German engineers tried reinforcing beams, adding internal shielding, modifying angles, but none of it erased the fundamental flaw Jimmy had discovered. They could not eliminate structural gaps. Those gaps were part of the bones of the construction. They existed everywhere, and the Americans now knew where to look. German intelligence documents recovered after the war described this new American ability with almost superstitious confusion. Some officers blamed allied engineers, others assumed a new kind of weapon. None guessed the truth. It all came from a Boston kid who once banked pool shots for pocket change. But perhaps the strangest part was how little any of this touched Jimmy personally. His name didn't appear in reports. His superiors didn't praise him in briefings, no medals, no ceremonies. He wasn't the kind of man who pushed himself forward anyway. But even if he had been, the army wasn't ready to officially endorse an idea so unconventional. There was fear that too many would attempt it without the instinct or precision to pull it off. So instead, the credit dissolved into the fabric of the division, the technique becoming a shared secret with no single author. Jimmy didn't complain. He didn't need recognition. What mattered were the faces he didn't have to bury, the telegrams that didn't get sent. When he lay in his foxhole at night, listening to distant artillery that no longer owned the valley the way it once had, he felt something like peace, fragile, temporary, but real enough. He had bent the rules. he had bent the war. And nobody but the men beside him would ever fully know. Orders from high up eventually acknowledged that something unusual was happening on the front, but they never traced it back to him. A colonel from Army intelligence arrived weeks later, crisp uniform, polished boots, the kind of officer who measured the world through paperwork rather than dirt and blood. He interviewed men, inspected ruined bunkers, scribbled notes, and nodded thoughtfully as if he alone could decode the sudden shift in American fortunes. When he filed his classified assessment, he credited the improvement to enhanced sniper training and better identification of enemy fortification patterns. It was the kind of vague, polished explanation that fit neatly into a report, but had nothing to do with the truth. Jimmy's name appeared nowhere. Not as an innovator, not as a contributor, not even as a footnote. The colonel left satisfied, unaware that the knowledge he sought had been passed from soldier to soldier in foxholes, sketched on ration boxes, whispered at night under artillery-lit skies. The kind of living doctrine the army never acknowledges until long after the fact. By the time spring deepened across Italy, the technique was no longer just Jimmy's strange idea. It belonged to the men who risked learning it, refining it, trusting it. Snipers across the 36th Division attempted deflection shots with increasing confidence. 8 hit their marks in the first week, 7 missed but tried again, adjusting their calculations until they got closer. Jimmy watched them grow in skill, watched the spark in their eyes, the same spark he'd felt the moment he first saw that sliver of possibility above the firing slit. Bunkers that had cost dozens of lives in February were abandoned by April. Those once invincible positions now carried a quiet dread for the Germans. Psychological pressure did half the work. Observers hesitated, unsure where safety ended and death began. Each hesitation cut into their response time. Every second gained saved American lives. The war didn't magically become easier. The mountains still bled. Artillery still fell like vengeful rain. Men still died, far too many of them. But there was a difference now, a subtle tilt in the balance. Infantrymen advanced with fewer losses, patrols returned with more survivors. The valley that once belonged to German eyes now belonged to uncertainty. And in the chaos of shifting fronts, Jimmy felt a strange mix of pride and grief. Pride for what the technique accomplished. Grief because every victory seemed to echo the voices of the men who never got the chance to see it work. Morrison, Chen, Donovan. Their deaths carved deep into him, shaping every calculation he made. Their absence was the reason he'd taken the risk in the first place. And even as the technique spread across Italy, across units, across nationalities, he carried those names like coordinates he refused to forget. When the British 8th Army picked up the trick, taught informally by a sniper who'd seen Jimmy sketching deflection paths at a supply depot, it became clear the idea had outgrown anything he could contain. It traveled the way truth often does in war, person to person, story to story, through necessity rather than praise. Some British officer asked where the technique came from. The sniper shrugged and said, "Yank corporal showed me." Didn't catch his name. And with that, the origin slid further into anonymity. The shot that had rewritten doctrine was now a rumor carried across nations, altered slightly with each retelling, but always rooted in the same impossible idea, that a man could bend a bullet's path with nothing but understanding. Jimmy didn't mind. He wasn't building a legacy. He was trying to prevent more graves. By the summer of 1944, the technique had slipped so deeply into the fabric of frontline knowledge that no one questioned where it came from anymore. It simply existed, something snipers were doing now, like it had always been part of the craft. What had begun as one desperate shot in a ruined farmhouse now lived in the muscle memory of dozens of men. Some drew angles on their palms before taking positions. Others carved tiny notches into their rifle stocks to help visualize deflection paths. In foxholes, they whispered measurements the way gamblers whisper odds. And without ever knowing it, they were repeating the language Jimmy had created, the quiet vocabulary of geometry under fire. He would sit among them sometimes, listening as they explained the trick to newcomers, watching their hands move through the air tracing the same arcs he had once drawn on cigarette packs. They didn't mention his name, not out of disrespect, simply because the method felt bigger than any one man. In a strange way, that anonymity felt fitting. War didn't care about authorship, it cared about survival. Then came the moment when even the Germans could no longer pretend they understood the battlefield they had designed so carefully. German snipers and engineers began finding bullets embedded in places they couldn't explain. Deep inside beams, angled scars on steel, impact marks under roof supports. Some of the wounds on dead observers made no sense according to standard ballistics. They suspected trickery, sabotage, even allied internal spies. But the truth was much simpler and far harder to accept. The Americans had figured out how to shoot in ways the Germans themselves had never imagined. Reports recovered after the war captured their confusion almost painfully. American sniper demonstrated ability to deliver fire from impossible trajectory through structural gap. Impossible trajectory. The phrase repeated itself across multiple documents. Like a superstition, the Germans couldn't quite shake. They started pulling observers back even farther, sometimes 12 feet or more into the bunkers, but doing so reduced their field of vision to a narrow, crippled slice. They could see less, they reacted slower, and sometimes, just sometimes, even that extra distance wasn't enough to save them. For the Americans, the psychological effect was profound. Soldiers who had once crawled through mud expecting artillery to fall at any second now moved with something close to confidence. Patrol leaders noticed, sergeants noticed, even the hardened veterans, the ones too tired to feel hope anymore, began muttering that maybe, just maybe, the valley wasn't cursed after all. Casualty reports reflected the change. The numbers dropped in ways statisticians would later call statistically significant, though the soldiers themselves had simpler ways of describing it. We lost fewer men this week. Our boys made it back. The bunkers don't see us like they used to. It wasn't just the technique that saved lives. It was the shift in mindset that followed. The understanding that the enemy wasn't invincible, that innovation could crack even the hardest fortifications. Through it all, Jimmy moved like a man half present, half distant. He didn't celebrate. He didn't boast. He didn't even correct the men who passed the technique along without mentioning him. He simply kept working, kept teaching, kept calculating. But there were nights, quiet ones, when the sky glowed faintly from distant bombardments, when he allowed himself to sit alone and absorb the strange truth of what he had done, not the physics of it, not the strategic value, but the human weight. 381 lives. That was the estimate someone later calculated. The number of Americans who didn't die because of the technique born in Jimmy Keller's tired mind. He didn't know that figure then, of course, but he knew the faces. He'd seen too many men buried, too many letters handed to trembling hands back home. If his strange way of seeing angles meant fewer of those letters arrived, that was enough. Recognition never came, not in the way people imagine when they think of wartime brilliance. There was no ceremony, no officer shaking his hand, no citation stamped with an official seal. Jimmy's service record remained painfully ordinary. Expert marksman, 19 confirmed kills, participation in multiple campaigns. Nothing about innovation, nothing about a technique that spread across armies, nothing about the lives saved. And the strange part was that he didn't resent it. He'd seen enough to know how the army worked. The ideas that fit neatly into doctrine were celebrated. The ones born from desperation and intuition were quietly absorbed, sanded down, and reissued as if they'd always been there. Maybe that's why he never pushed for acknowledgement. Recognition felt small compared to the weight of what he'd seen, the men he'd buried, the promises made in foxholes and broken in sudden, brutal moments. He knew who the innovation belonged to. The men beside him knew. That was enough. When the war finally ended and he stepped off the troopship in November 1945, Jimmy looked older than his 24 years. Combat ages the body, but grief ages the soul. Charlestown hadn't changed much. Same cramped buildings, same smell of diesel and salt from the Navy Yard, same weary rhythm of working-class life. He slipped back into that rhythm, a man stepping into old boots. The dock jobs were already taken by those who'd stayed stateside, but the Navy Yard remembered him. He returned to the cranes, the rigging, the delicate balance of weight and tension. It was strange how the world treated him as if he had never left, as if the things he'd done overseas were dreams he wasn't meant to speak of, and he didn't speak of them. Not because he wanted to forget, but because he didn't know how to translate what he'd lived into something people at home could understand. He married a nurse named Catherine 2 years later. Drawn to her steady kindness and the way she didn't ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. They built a small, ordinary life together. 3 children, Sunday dinners, afternoons at the park, quiet nights in a house that smelled of coffee and laundry soap. Jimmy taught his kids to play pool the same way he had taught himself, showing them how every shot had 10 possible outcomes, how geometry was hidden everywhere if you knew how to look. He never mentioned that those same instincts had once saved lives. He never explained why certain loud noises made him flinch, or why he sometimes stayed awake until dawn staring at the ceiling. His children thought he simply liked early mornings. Catherine knew better, but she loved him without demanding confessions he wasn't ready to give. Decades passed. He worked 32 years at the Navy Yard and retired at 56 with a reputation as the best crane operator in Boston. The kind of man people trusted because he never spoke carelessly, never took shortcuts, never acted like he was smarter than anyone else. He attended Red Sox games with his grandchildren, fished at Nahant Beach in the summers, and played quiet games of pool at the VFW Hall, where nobody knew how deeply the angles in his mind once mattered. To everyone around him, he was just Jimmy, steady, reliable, a good man. When he died in 1998, the obituary was modest. One sentence mentioned his military service. None spoke of the bean gap shot. None spoke of the innovation that outlived him. None spoke of the hundreds of men who survived, because he saw the world differently. His gravestone stood among rows of identical markers in a quiet cemetery in Everett. Name, rank, dates of service, perfectly ordinary on the surface. But beneath that simple marker lay the truth of a man who changed the course of battle with medals or commands, but with geometry, grief, and courage no battlefield manual ever taught. War remembers its explosions, its victories, its flag-raising moments, but it rarely remembers the quiet revolutions born in the shadows. Jimmy Keller's story lives in those shadows, not because it deserves to be hidden, but because some kinds of brilliance are too human, too raw, too unpolished for the tidy lines of official history. His was the kind of genius that appears only when the world is at its breaking point, a blue-collar mind shaped by pool tables and shipyards, a mind that saw possibility where others saw dead ends. He didn't save lives with speeches or medals or commanding presence. He saved them with geometry drawn on cigarette packs, with stubbornness, with the refusal to accept that the deaths around him were inevitable. That's the strange thing about real heroes. They almost never think they're heroes. Jimmy didn't walk away from the war thinking he'd changed anything. He walked away thinking about the friends he'd lost, the shots he couldn't take back, the promises the dead would never fulfill. History moved on. Armies rewrote manuals. Snipers around the world learned techniques born from his instincts. And yet the man himself faded quietly into a life of cranes and coffee and Red Sox games, never once telling his children that the angles he taught them over a pool table were the same angles that once bent a bullet into the heart of an enemy fortress. Innovation in war isn't always forged in laboratories or strategized in rooms full of brass. Sometimes it's born in a cold farmhouse, in the hands of a corporal who can't bear to watch one more friend die. Sometimes it's born from heartbreak, from exhaustion, from the simple stubborn belief that the world must make room for a solution even when none seems to exist. Jimmy Keller, as he stood on a podium, he never heard his name spoken at a ceremony. But every life saved by the technique he invented, every soldier who came home because an observer never called down fire, is a testament to the truth history nearly forgot. Maybe that's the real measure of a legacy, not the honors you receive, but the lives that echo quietly because of you. Jimmy Keller changed the war with a single impossible shot. And the world never knew his name, but now you do.